A while ago, I started a series of videos about my favorite point-and-shoot camera, and I had intended on making a lot more videos in that series because over the years I had bought and sold lots and lots of different point-and-shoot cameras, but I eventually just stopped sitting down and making videos about them, unfortunately. So today I wanted to share with you the camera that I would consider to be my favorite point-and-shoot film camera, even though it's not even technically a point-and-shoot. It's just I kind of use it that way, and I'll explain it when we get to it. The camera I'm talking about is this one, the Rollei 35. More specifically, I have the Rollei 35T, and we'll talk a little bit about those differences. The Rollei 35 and the Rollei 35T, and also the Rollei 35S, are three different models of essentially the same camera, the difference being the lens or where the camera is produced. This camera was originally produced in the 1960s in Germany, and when it was released it was hailed as the smallest full-frame 35mm mechanical camera, fully mechanical camera. And just that moniker, I mean, how could you not love it? That's part of what I love about it. It is essentially a tiny camera that is fully mechanical, doesn't require a battery to run, and it just feels like you're holding a piece of genius machinery. It feels like a tool. It's got a nice weight to it. You can feel like it's like metal. It's got a nice grippy leatherette here. It just feels like quality. At the same time, it's really small, convenient to carry, and not too heavy, relatively lightweight compared to a SLR or any of these other kind of cameras. Not to say it doesn't have its limitations. We'll get to that a bit later. Just for a little history, these cameras were produced originally in Germany, starting in the 1960s, 60 plus years ago. I feel old. Not that I bought this when it was first released, of course. Eventually, to save money, the production was moved to Singapore, and the model that I have here was created by Rollei Singapore. The three models I'm going to talk about are the original Rollei 35, the Rollei 35T, which is this one, and the Rollei 35S. So the original Rollei 35 was produced in Germany in the Rollei factories where they make Rolleiflex and Rolleicord and those other well-known and loved medium format cameras. This one I have here was produced in Singapore. When they moved to Singapore, they renamed them to the Rollei 35T, T being for Tessar. This has a f3.5 40mm Tessar lens. And then you have the Rollei 35S, which the S stands for sonar. They have the 40mm also sonar lens, and that one has a 2.8 aperture, so slightly brighter aperture on that one. And that one will fetch a higher price, of course. I picked this one up for around $100, which is a good price. I mean, generally they go for between maybe $100 and $250, depending on where you go. So I kind of just waited around until I found one for a good price. The Rollei 35S with the sonar lens, it tends to go for a bit more, maybe $250 to $350, but it's been a while since I bought one of these. The prices could have gone up even more, I'm not quite sure. Something I love about this camera is just how fully manual it is, and at the same time how quickly you can use it. If you look at the top of the camera here, you see here we have these two dials on either side of the lens. This is where we're going to set our aperture and shutter speed. You have a little pusher on the bottom that you can push up in order to spin the dial so you don't accidentally change the settings. So when you don't push up on the button, you can't spin the wheel. This one, the shutter speed one, you can just spin. So the aperture one has this little locking mechanism, which is nice. In order to use the camera, you actually have to pull out the lens like this, and then you twist it and it will lock into place and you'll hear a click like this. And now the camera is ready to be used. And if you take a photo, you get that nice satisfying click. And then when you're done, you have this release, this button up on top here. It allows you to twist the lens back out of being locked, and then you can push it back in. So the lens, when pushed in, is quite compact, and then the overall camera is a nice small size that you can fit easily into a jacket pocket or your big Junko pockets or some larger jeans perhaps. A great feature about this is that when the lens is retracted as it is now, you can't actually fire the shutter. So there will be no accidental pocket photos. And then when the lens is in place, then you can click the shutter. Another thing is you can't collapse the lens unless if you've taken a photo, unless you crank to the next exposure. So you'll always have the exposure ready for your next shot. It doesn't allow you to close the lens with the shutter uncocked. And if you try to force it, you might break it, so don't do that. This camera actually does take a battery for the light meter, which you can see on top here is this window. It does indeed have a light meter. It was originally created to use mercury batteries, which are no longer produced. However, you can get a zinc oxide battery, I believe it's called, which I have in here. I think it's died. This was working before, but now it doesn't seem to be reacting to the light. I didn't even notice because I never used the light meter on this. I've had 2 or 3 models of this camera before that I had sold previously, and all of those previous models, the light meter never worked. So I think generally the light meter doesn't usually work. In my case it did, but now the battery has probably died, and I'm not sure. Maybe I'll just not get a new battery because you don't really need it if you're using Sunny 16 or if you have a flash or whatever. Another cool tidbit about this camera, it was famously taken across country in a road trip by Stephen Shore, famous photographer, and he made a book out of the photos taken exclusively with this camera. If you want, let's compare to some other cameras. Here I have the Leica M3, and you can see side by side. The Leica M3 is quite a compact camera. However, the Rollei 35 is indeed a fair bit smaller and lighter. Another camera I can show you is probably my smallest point and shoot, is this Olympus Epic, Stylus Epic, or Mu 2. Side by side, they're a pretty similar size. The Olympus is of course much lighter. And the Olympus does slide a bit easier into the pocket due to its kind of curved shape. So the Olympus is easier to carry for sure, but the Rollei 35 is just so much more satisfying to use, if I'm going to be honest. It's great. I really like it. Let's talk about some more features. On the bottom here we actually have a hot shoe, which will fire a flash. It's not a cold shoe, it's an actual hot shoe, which is lovely. You have your frame counter, you have your rewind lever when you're ready to rewind the film. You have this case opener, and then it slides off. In order to load the film, you would stick it in there, drag it over, crank it a couple of times, and then this pressure plate here goes on top of the film before you slide the back on. You can also see back here, if you can see that, that's where the battery goes for the light meter. You just need a coin or something to unscrew that and then replace the battery if you want to. So very compact. Everything is extremely packed in there. I just love this camera. It's great for traveling. It's great for, I've taken it to weddings, street photos. It's unassuming. The shutter sound is really quiet, as you've heard. Doesn't really attract that much attention. You can get it in silver, but I really like this all black model. It's just so nice and stealthy to look at. I've gotten this little button off eBay. It's just a little screw-on shutter button that was originally for a Leica camera, but otherwise the shutter button is a little bit recessed, so I kind of like having this little easy push button on top there. If you want to get really funky, you can attach a flash like this here, Context TLA 140. Just stick it on the bottom there. And you can go around shooting photos like this. It's great because it looks so ridiculous, but actually it works quite well. It fires the flash with the hot shoe, and you get some really great exposures. And once you get the hang of its quirks, it's really actually quite easy to use. Don't you just love how this looks? It looks so stupid. I had mentioned that it doesn't attract attention. If you put a flash on it, it immediately attracts attention. Everyone is like, what the hell is this thing you're using? I brought it to a wedding like this, and like everyone was asking me, what is wrong with you? What is this piece of junk you're taking photos of us with? It was hilarious, but everyone wanted to try it and it was fun. The biggest drawback of this camera is the kind of learning curve, you could say. The reason being twofold. One, the light meter is probably not going to work, so you're most likely going to have to manually expose this. I mean, either way, you're doing a manual exposure, but you might have to just guess using the Sunny 16 rule, which I find works pretty well. The other thing is this may look like a rangefinder camera, but there's no rangefinder. So you actually just have to guess the distance between you and your subject. And this, I would say, is the biggest drawback that people would mention if they were to bring up this camera. So if you look at the lens, let's see if I can focus on there, you see that you have some markings about different distances. This is kind of like the typical, I mean, all lenses will really have this, and maybe you don't notice it, maybe you use it, but what you basically have to do is you have to do something called zone focusing. So what that means is you see the distance on the front of the lens here in meters, and then you have to kind of use the numbers here based on the aperture. So if you're at aperture 16, f16, then everything in between the small 16 on the one side and the small 16 on the other side is going to be in focus. And as you get a smaller and smaller aperture, what is in focus becomes a smaller and smaller range. Of course, if you have f16, you have a larger range of what's going to be in focus, and if you're at f3.5, you have the smallest range, which is just this middle dot. So the way that I tend to use this camera with the Sunny 16 rule is often you have f16 or f11, and then if you're at f16, for example, I'll just set it here, and I'll just show you how it looks. So what I do is I set infinity to the one side 16 number here, if you can see that. Infinity on one side, and then everything up till 2 meters. From 2 meters to infinity is going to be in focus. So that's a pretty wide range. I mean, if you're basically not standing right up next to something, it's going to be in focus. That's pretty easy, right? That's not that hard to do. And then if you're going to be really close, then you just like spin it a little bit. Let's say you want it from everything from 2 meters to 1 meter. Then you can just spin it like this. I hope you can see that. You put the 2 on the right side, and then the 1 lines up on the left side. So everything from 1 to 2 meters will be in focus if you're a little bit closer. It's really quite simple. It takes a little bit of getting used to, but it's not that hard. If you're indoors, maybe you're going to use a small aperture and it's kind of tricky. It might be slightly blurry. You might kind of miss a little bit on guessing the number of meters away your subject is. I get that. But then I can also just use a flash. You slap the flash on, then you can use something like f8 or f11, and then you again have a kind of wide range of what's in focus. So this is not a camera that you will buy to get these nice shallow depth of focus photos. It's not really that kind of camera. If you can get over the few small kind of hurdles with this camera, the learning curve, the slightly slower, I mean, it's a slower workflow than if you're just like grabbing a point and shoot and taking a photo. Of course, this is going to be way faster than this, but I think you'll find that it's a lot more satisfying in the long run. to use a camera like this where you have the convenience of the size and portability, you have the convenience of not worrying about a battery that's going to die. You have all the controls at your fingertips, everything's right here. And once you get the hang of it, it's like second nature. And if you're out in a sunny day and you just kind of set it to your sunny 16 settings and you set your focus to infinity to 2 meters, then you can kind of just go around and snap without even thinking about it, and it becomes extremely fast to use, even faster than a point and shoot, I would say. Once you have all your settings set, as long as the light isn't constantly changing throughout your shoot, you can kind of just take a bunch of photos and not even really think about the settings, and it becomes really like, I don't know, I don't want to say zen, but I want to say zen. Yeah, so you basically just look through the viewfinder and you snap your photo, and it's extremely fast, and I really love that about this. It's also kind of built like a tank in some ways, and in some ways not. For example, when I was walking around in New York a few years ago, I pulled it out of my pocket and it just like, I don't know, caught on something and flew out of my hand and smashed onto the pavement in the streets in New York, and I got like a couple of scratches you can see on here, like it's a scratch here and like maybe like a ding here, but that's it. I mean, nothing broke, everything works perfectly, and I was really kind of shocked. It was amazing. I was really scared when it fell, and then I picked it up and it looked almost perfectly fine, which was great. But one downside I have noticed, because I've owned a few of these cameras I've bought and sold over the years, one downside I would say is that there are some plastic gears inside some of these. So I had one model here where there was a gear that you use for advancing the film, and eventually it started to just give out. So in the beginning I would take a photo and then I would crank it and it wouldn't go all the way, so I'd have to crank it maybe twice or 2 or 3 times to get to the next exposure, and then eventually it just wouldn't crank to the next exposure at all. I did a lot of research online, and people mentioned that there was a plastic gear where the teeth can wear out, and I took the camera apart and looked inside, and sure enough there was this gear that was worn out. It probably would have been possible to maybe 3D print or find someone who had a similar gear and replace it myself, but instead of doing that, I just sold it to someone who wanted to display it in their home collection. They weren't going to use it, they just liked the look of it, so I eventually just sold it off and ended up buying a new working one. Another thing I'll mention is the difference between the Rollei 35T and the Rollei 35S. Besides the aperture size, the one difference that's interesting is that the lens here on the 35T actually comes out a bit further. So on the 35S, it comes out to about that far, which is kind of an interesting difference. So for some people, that's going to be really nice that it doesn't come out as far. It's going to be like a smaller profile when you're using the camera. I mean, when the lens is like retracted into the body, it looks the same. It's fine. It's the same thing. But when you pull it out, the 35S kind of comes out to about there, whereas the 35T is a few millimeters further. Otherwise, it works exactly the same way. For me, I ended up going with the 35T because I find that the Tessar lens, it just looks better in my opinion. I like the photos better, which is weird because generally I like the Sonar lenses. I have some for my Sony camera, and I have one for my Leica. I generally really like the Sonar profile, but for some reason on these Rollei 35s, the Tessar I like much better. I don't know what it is. And another thing I wanted to talk about is that if you like this camera and you hate the idea of manually focusing it, and you think you'd never get the hang of the zone focusing, so you're totally off this camera, I just wanted to mention that that there's a new project that I'm signed up on the mailing list for, where I think it's Mint Camera who is creating a autofocus new Rollei 35, and this camera is it's like based on the old one, but it's fully new, licensed by Rollei, so it is like actually going to have the Rollei name on it, but it's going to be made by Mint Camera, and I'm really looking forward to that. I definitely want to pick one up when it's ready. I've seen some samples from it and it looks amazing. I really love the profile of this camera. I love the look, I love the size, and I would definitely not mind having an autofocus variant of it. I think it's even going to have a built-in flash. I don't really remember. It's been a little while since I've gotten an email update from them. I'll post a link about it in the description if you want to check it out. Definitely get on the mailing list for that. I mean, I think it's great that film has made a resurgence, and it's still making a resurgence. I love that people are making new film cameras. I would love to get my hands on one of the Pentax ones as well. But for me, this camera is just really special to me. It's close to my heart, and I use it more than I would say any of my other film cameras. It's great. I love this thing. While we're here, I just want to say a quick thank you for being here, checking out the channel, even though, of course, I know it hasn't been the most active lately. I do intend on posting more, but I just wanted to toss this out there. I haven't been buying and selling cameras as much as I was a few years ago. I'm still taking photos, maybe not as much as before, but I'm getting into other hobbies, I'm doing other things, and I think this channel may eventually evolve into a more general channel about me exploring different hobbies, not just cameras. So if you're only interested in cameras, let me know. If you're open to me just blabbering about random topics or random hobbies that I get into, I hope that would be fine for you, because I feel like part of what's held me back for uploading to this channel is the limitation of just posting camera video after camera video. I know there are other channels that do that and they do a great job, but for me, I feel like I don't want to be limited to just one thing. I like to just go out and explore, and well, hopefully you will want to come along for the ride. Anyway, thank you for watching. Thanks for being here, and see you all soon. Bye-bye.